Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we'll be exploring the potential global impact of President Trump's policies. We're going to be talking about when America First was the kind of defining principle of American politics and how all that might have played out on the world stage.
It's like really taking the what-if scenario a step further. We're not just kind of looking at campaign promises, right?
Yeah.
We're thinking about like the potential global consequences based on, the actual actions that the Trump administration took.
Right. And we've got some really fascinating sources here. We're talking trade, immigration, foreign policy, even climate change. Why don't we start with trade and economics? One of the big things that you highlighted was President Trump's decision to renegotiate NAFTA. And that, of course, had a huge impact on Canada and Mexico.
For sure. I think what's really interesting is that, the renegotiated agreement with the USMCA really did kind of shift the balance in favor of certain U.S. sectors, like think agriculture, automobiles.
Yeah.
And so this meant that Canada and Mexico had to make adjustments to accommodate those shifts. But it's interesting. It wasn't just about North America. This move signaled a much broader shift in U.S. trade policy, and it created friction even with traditional allies like the EU.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to tariffs on steel and aluminum and cars.
Yeah, it's fascinating how those tariffs on steel and aluminum actually ended up hitting Germany particularly hard because they're, a manufacturing powerhouse.
Right.
But of course, no conversation about trade during this era would be complete without talking about China. It seemed like, every other day there was a new headline about tariffs or intellectual property disputes.
It was a high-stakes game. The Trump administration, they saw China's trade practices as fundamentally unfair. And they launched this series of tariffs that were aimed at protecting American businesses and intellectual property. But you have to remember, these things don't exist in a vacuum, right? They set off this chain reaction, disrupting global supply chains, affecting businesses and consumers worldwide.
It wasn't just about soybeans and steel. You made a really good point about how this trade war had a particularly destabilizing effect on the global tech sector.
Yeah.
Companies that relied on components from both the U.S. and China were just scrambling.
Totally. Companies had to make some tough choices.
Yeah.
Do they absorb the increased costs, pass them on to consumers, or completely restructure their supply chains?
Right.
It was a period of immense uncertainty for businesses.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about reacting to the trade war either. President Trump made this big push for a revival of domestic manufacturing in the U.S. On the surface, that sounds great, bring jobs back home, right?
Right.
But what about the unintended consequences?
That's where this interconnectedness of the global economy really comes into play. While a resurgence in U.S. manufacturing might benefit some American workers, it could have a negative impact on export-driven economies, particularly in Asia.
That makes sense. Countries like China, Southeast Asia, they'd built their economies around exporting goods to the U.S., and then suddenly that demand is shrinking.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to manufactured goods. You raised a really good point about India.
Right.
Their IT and service industries, even they could feel the pressure if U.S. companies start bringing those jobs back home as well.
Wow. So we're seeing how this America First approach to trade really had some major ripple effects, both intended and unintended. Why don't we move on to another big area that you flagged, and that's immigration. I mean, it's impossible to talk about the Trump administration without mentioning that infamous border wall.
Yeah, that was a cornerstone of his campaign, the idea of building a physical barrier along the U.S. Mexico border to curb illegal immigration. And just the symbolism of that alone, that would have put a strain on relations with Mexico.
It's hard to imagine that going over well.
No.
With any neighboring country. And it seems like the impact went way beyond just diplomatic friction.
Right. We have to think about like the economic and social implications as well. Increased border security, stricter immigration enforcement would probably lead to a decrease in remittances sent back to Central American countries.
Yeah.
And those economies, they really rely on that income.
So we're talking about Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. These folks would feel the effects of these policies thousands of miles away. It's that ripple effect again.
It is. And then there's the question of the travel bans. Targeting citizens from several Muslim-majority nations, while framed as national security measures, they definitely impacted immigration from those countries and strained diplomatic relations.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that this sent a message that was heard far beyond just the countries that were directly targeted, right?
Yeah.
The Muslim community worldwide was watching this.
Yeah, you're right. This raises these important questions about America's global image and its relationship with Muslim-majority allies. places like Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Even if they weren't directly affected by the travel bans, those actions just contributed to this broader sense of unease and uncertainty about America's role in the world.
Okay, so we've got trade wars brewing, immigration is getting tightened up, and now we're about to dive into foreign policy and alliances. This is where things start to get really interesting, especially when we think about, the impact on long-standing relationships.
This is where we see a major shift in how the U.S. engaged with the rest of the world.
Mm.
President Trump was very vocal in his criticism of NATO allies, accusing them of not contributing enough to defense spending
Right.
and even suggesting a reduced U.S. involvement.
So essentially saying, you guys need to pay your fair share or we might not have your back. That must have sent some shockwaves through Europe.
It did, especially for countries like Germany and France. They relied on the U.S.'s security guarantees for decades,
Yeah.
and they were suddenly faced with the prospect of having to drastically increase their defense budgets, potentially diverting resources from other priorities.
I can only imagine that didn't go over too well with some European leaders.
It didn't. There was this sense of frustration with what they perceived as President Trump's transactional approach to alliances. They felt like he was prioritizing short-term gains over the long-term stability and security of this transatlantic partnership.
And it's important to remember that this tension played out against the backdrop of those existing trade disputes, right, between the U.S. and the EU.
Right.
So it just adds another layer of complexity to the relationship.
It's like this delicate ecosystem where one change can set off this cascade of unintended consequences.
Wow.
And speaking of complex relationships, let's turn to the U.S.'s approach to China, which went way beyond trade.
Yeah. It really seemed like President Trump was playing this high-stakes game of geopolitical chess,
Right.
confronting China on multiple fronts. Trade imbalances, military aggression in the South China Sea, technological competition.
Exactly. It was this multi-pronged approach designed to push back against what the administration saw as China's unfair practices and growing global influence. But this assertive approach carried the risk of escalation, potentially pushing the two superpowers towards a more confrontational relationship.
And let's not forget North Korea. Those summits with Kim Jong-un were straight out of a movie. One minute we're on the brink of war, the next they're shaking hands.
President Trump's approach to North Korea was certainly unorthodox,
It was.
relying on personal diplomacy and dramatic gestures. While it did lead to this temporary thaw in relations and a halt in missile tests, denuclearization talks ultimately remained inconclusive.
So a lot of fanfare, but no real lasting solution. And all of this back and forth, it must have made America's allies in the region, particularly Japan and South Korea, pretty nervous. They rely on the U.S. for security.
Yeah, you're right. This approach could have been viewed as destabilizing by those countries who depended on the U.S.'s security guarantees. Their anxieties and concerns would have been a major factor in the U.S.'s strategic calculations.
Okay, so we've got trade tensions with China, uncertainty in Europe, and this unpredictable approach to North Korea. It seems like this America First policy was sending shockwaves across the globe.
It was a period of significant change and upheaval in the international order.
Mm.
And I think nowhere was that more evident than in the Middle East.
You're right. We can't talk about President Trump's impact on the Middle East without mentioning his very pro-Israel stance.
Yep.
Which led to some very significant actions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem was incredibly controversial, especially for the Palestinians who saw East Jerusalem as the potential capital of their future state.
Right.
And then you have the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab nations.
Now, the Abraham Accords, they were hailed by some as this major diplomatic breakthrough.
Yeah.
But they also raised some concerns about the future of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and, the potential for further marginalization of Palestinians.
Right. Those accords didn't come without their own set of complexities and potential drawbacks. It's like a multidimensional chessboard where every move has implications that extend far beyond the initial action.
And speaking of complex, we haven't even touched on climate change yet, which was another area where President Trump's policies differed drastically from his predecessors.
Yeah, that's right. His decision to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, that was a major turning point, signaling a shift away from multilateral efforts to address climate change.
And this wasn't just symbolic. The U.S. withdrawing from that agreement had real consequences for global efforts to combat climate change.
It did. It created this void in leadership, potentially slowing down global momentum towards reducing emissions and investing in renewable energy.
Right.
It also raised questions about the U.S.'s commitment to addressing this global challenge that requires collective action.
We can't forget about his push for what he called energy independence, boosting domestic production of fossil fuels, including coal.
Yes, that was a key part of his America First energy policy. By increasing domestic production of oil and gas, the U.S. could reduce its reliance on foreign imports, potentially impacting the global energy market and reducing the leverage of these traditional oil-producing nations.
But of course, this comes at a cost, right?
Yeah.
Greater reliance on fossil fuels, particularly coal. I mean, that has some significant environmental implications, especially when the world's trying to move towards cleaner energy sources.
It does, and this really highlights the trade-offs and complexities that are just inherent in these policy decisions.
Hmm.
It's not always a clear-cut win-lose scenario. There are often unintended consequences and ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate goals.
So we've seen how President Trump's America First agenda played out across the world, from trade wars and shifting alliances to heightened tensions in the Middle East and this changing global order. It's clear that even hypothetical scenarios can have very real consequences.
And it's this reminder that we live in an interconnected world, right?
Yeah.
Where one nation's actions, especially those of a global superpower like the U.S., can ripple outward and affect people and events far beyond its borders.
This has been an incredible journey so far. We've just scratched the surface of this fascinating period. But before we dive into the specific impact on different regions, I want to take a quick look inward.
Yes, it's crucial to understand how these outward-facing policies reverberated within Mexican society itself.
Exactly. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll explore the domestic implications of President Trump's America First agenda. We'll see how these policies might have shaped everything from political discourse to economic realities and the very fabric of American identity. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been talking about all the potential global impacts of President Trump's America First policies, but as we all know, every action has a reaction, and those ripples would have been felt right here at home too.
It's interesting, to explore how those outward-facing policies might have, boomeranged back and ended up influencing everything from the economy to social dynamics in the U.S.
It's like throwing a rock into a pond, right?
Hmm.
The initial splash is just the beginning, but then those ripples spread out and they can have these unexpected effects far from where the rock landed.
Yeah.
And in your sources, you pointed to China as one of the first places those ripples would have hit.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they talked about the
Trade
trade.
war, but I think it's important to go beyond just the headlines and think about what was the on-the-ground impact.
Yeah.
For China, those tariffs, they triggered economic slowdowns, particularly in those export-oriented sectors, leading to job losses and, increased costs for just everyday people.
You even brought up a specific example in one of your sources about how, the price of pork went up significantly because of the tariffs on U.S. soybeans, which are used as animal feed. And pork, of course, that's a staple of the Chinese diet.
It is. It's those everyday impacts that really bring home the complexity of these global events. But, it's not just about hardship. One of your sources suggested that the trade war might have actually fueled this sense of nationalism in China,
Oh, interesting.
leading to a renewed focus on, domestic innovation and self-reliance.
Okay, so it's like a double-edged sword. Economic pain in the short term,
Yeah.
but potentially pushing them towards greater independence, maybe even technological advancement in the long run.
Exactly. And those ripple effects, they extend far beyond China's borders. Remember those disrupted global supply chains we talked about? Countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, who played this really vital role in the global garment and electronics industries. They would have felt the impact as companies scrambled to, diversify their production.
So it's this interconnected web where a trade dispute between two superpowers can end up impacting, garment workers in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, precisely. And this kind of brings us back to the U.S. and its relationship with Europe. We talked about the tension over NATO funding, but how might that have played out in real terms for those European nations, especially the ones that are, right on the border with Russia?
Well, one of your sources talked about how President Trump's questioning of, the U.S.'s commitment to NATO really created the sense of vulnerability in those countries.
It did. They were forced to confront the possibility of having to take on a much larger share of the defense burden and potentially diverting resources away from other priorities, like social programs or infrastructure.
Yeah. I imagine that didn't go over too well with some European leaders.
It didn't. There was this sense of frustration.
Right.
They felt like, Trump was prioritizing short-term gains over the long-term stability and security of the transatlantic partnership.
You even mentioned this quote from one of your sources where a French diplomat kind of compared it to paying protection money to the U.S.,
Yeah.
which is a pretty powerful image.
It is. And this tension over security wasn't happening in isolation either. Remember, we also had those ongoing trade disputes between the U.S. and the EU.
Right.
So that just adds another layer of complexity to this already strained relationship.
So you've got China feeling the pressure of the trade war. Europe is anxious about the future of NATO. What about other parts of the world? You highlighted Latin America in your sources. How might they have navigated this turbulent period?
I think Latin America's experience would have been really diverse,
Mm.
but there would have been some common threads. Mexico, of course, bore the brunt of the border wall controversy
Hmm.
and those stricter immigration policies.
Mm.
And this, coupled with the renegotiation of NAFTA, created this kind of perfect storm of economic uncertainty and diplomatic tension.
And one of your sources even suggested that this situation might have pushed Mexico to strengthen its ties with other countries, so potentially reducing its economic reliance on the U.S.
That's a fascinating possibility.
Yeah.
It highlights how these shifting geopolitical alliances can create these opportunities for countries to redefine their relationships and maybe forge these new partnerships.
And it's not just Mexico. You pointed out that Central American countries who are already struggling with poverty and violence would face additional challenges
Yeah.
as remittances from the U.S. declined and, the flow of migrants north was restricted.
Right. Those remittances are a lifeline for so many families in those countries.
Yeah.
And a decrease in that income could have ripple effects throughout their entire economy.
Right.
It's another example of how seemingly distant policy decisions can have very real impacts on people's lives thousands of miles away.
And speaking of distant impacts, let's shift our focus over to the Middle East. It's already, as we all know, a complex and volatile region. You've highlighted how President Trump approached the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and his outreach to certain Arab states as potential game changers.
Yes, these were definitely some bold moves with far-reaching consequences. That decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, that was incredibly symbolic and deeply controversial, particularly for the Palestinians who saw it as a rejection of their claims to East Jerusalem.
And one of your sources argued that this move, while it was definitely welcomed by Israel, it might have actually made achieving a lasting peace agreement even more difficult.
Yeah, that's a valid point. I think it really depends on how you define peace, right?
Yeah.
For some, the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab nations, those were seen as this major step towards stability and cooperation in the region.
But for others, particularly the Palestinians, those accords were seen as further marginalization, a sidelining of their aspirations for an independent state.
Exactly. It just highlights the challenges of achieving a peace that satisfies all parties in this kind of complex and deeply rooted conflict. It's not a zero-sum game. There are winners and losers. And those perceptions of fairness and justice, they play a huge role in how these events unfold.
So we're seeing how these outward-facing policies, whether it's trade wars or these diplomatic maneuvers, they're having these unintended consequences, right? Creating winners and losers and just reshaping the global landscape.
It's like a giant game of Jenga.
Oh, yeah.
You pull out one piece,
Yeah.
and it might seem insignificant at first, but then you realize that it was holding up this whole section of the tower.
Right.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the U.S. itself. We've been talking about all the global impact, but how did these policies kind of reverberate within American society?
That's where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive. We'll explore the domestic consequences of America First, from the economic impacts to all the social and political shifts that might have occurred.
It's amazing to see how one administration's policies can have such a far-reaching consequences, both abroad and right here at home. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive as we bring it all back home to the U.S. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've gone all over the globe tracing these potential ripple effects of President Trump's America First policies. And now it's time to bring it all back home and see how all of those policies might have reshaped the landscape here in the U.S.
It's really interesting to think about how these outward-facing policies could have reverberated within American society,
Yeah.
influencing everything from the economy to social dynamics, even political discourse.
It's kind of like that saying, what goes around comes around, right? You put something out into the world and eventually it comes back to you, often in ways that you didn't really expect.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And I think one of the first places where you might have really felt those boomerang effects is in the American economy.
Hmm.
We talked about President Trump's trade wars, particularly the one with China, and they were aimed at protecting American jobs and industries.
Mhm.
But, the big question is, did they actually work?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question. And from the sources that you've given me, it seems like the answer is not quite so simple.
No, it's not a simple yes or no answer. The economic impact was complex and it was uneven. Some industries like steel and aluminum, they saw a resurgence thanks to tariffs on imports.
Okay.
But others, particularly those that relied on those global supply chains we were talking about, or those that were exporting goods to China, they faced higher costs and they ended up losing markets.
So it's not as simple as saying tariffs are always good or bad. It depends what industry you're talking about.
Exactly. And then you also have to think about the impact on American consumers. Those tariffs often meant higher prices for a lot of goods, which can fuel inflation and, kind of eat away at people's purchasing power.
Right. So even if some businesses are doing better, those gains could be wiped out just by having to pay more for everyday things. It's a trade-off.
Exactly.
What about those manufacturing jobs that were supposed to come back? Did that actually happen?
Well, one of the sources that you shared had a really interesting perspective on this. And they argued that while some companies did what's called reshore operations, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., the overall impact on manufacturing employment just wasn't as big as they had promised.
So it's more complicated than just saying, let's bring those factories back.
It is. The Made in America dream was more complex than just bringing back those factories. Automation and all these technological advancements, they were also changing manufacturing, often displacing workers, even in those sectors that, did see some production return to the U.S.
So it's not just about where things are made, it's how they're made, and that's changing all the time.
Exactly. And this kind of brings us to, I think, the social and political consequences of America First, which might be even more significant than the economic impacts.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me in your sources was how President Trump's rhetoric really resonated with certain people, folks who felt like they'd been left behind by things like globalization and all the economic changes happening. It kind of tapped into this anxiety about immigration, cultural shifts, and, this perceived loss of American influence around the world.
That's such an important point. It's not just about policies themselves, it's about those underlying narratives and the emotions that those policies evoke. And in this case, that America First rhetoric, it really seemed to tap into this deep well of frustration and resentment.
Right, and it's not hard to see how all of that could have led to a surge in nationalism and populism.
Exactly. We saw a resurgence of that nationalist sentiment. It was often expressed through support for stricter immigration policies, protectionist trade measures, and a more assertive, even isolationist foreign policy.
It's like people were kind of longing for a simpler time, a time when America felt more dominant on the world stage, more in control.
I think that's a powerful way to put it. And this nostalgia for a bygone era, it often kind of intersected with anxieties about how the demographics of the country were changing.
Yeah.
And that fueled anti-immigrant sentiment and even racial tensions.
And all of that just added to this increasingly polarized political climate, right? It felt like the country was being split into two camps, those who really embraced this whole America First idea and those who completely opposed it.
Yeah, you're right. And that polarization, those really deep divisions within American society, that might be the most lasting impact of this whole period. I mean, we're still dealing with those divisions today, and they continue to shape our political discourse, our social interactions.
It's like those ripple effects we talked about before, but playing out here at home. They can be even more subtle, maybe even more insidious than those big geopolitical shifts, but they're no less impactful in the long run.
I think you're so right. The way that American foreign policy kind of turned inward with that America First idea, it really had these profound consequences domestically. It shaped not just the economy, but social attitudes, political alignments, even the very fabric of what it means to be American.
Well, this has been a really incredible deep dive. We started off talking about the global impact of President Trump's policies, and now we've come full circle right back here to the U.S.
It has been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring this complex interplay between domestic and international forces, the intended and unintended consequences of policies, and all those ripple effects that extend way beyond their initial point of impact.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we live in a really interconnected world. Everything is connected to everything else. And as we move forward, I think it's really important to understand those connections, to try to anticipate those ripple effects, and to, strive for policies that benefit not just ourselves, but the world as a whole. That's the big challenge, and I think the big opportunity of our time. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.